Thank you so much for having me. Okay, so like Andre said, this is joint work with Slava Foss at BC, Ankit Kalda at Indiana University, and an Equifax rep, Naser Hamdi. So I'm going to start off with a slide that intends to be provocative, but I want to get my point across before you think we're doing something we're not. So this was a Wall Street Journal article, and the headline is "Uber and Lyft have a powerful new enemy in Washington." And essentially, the point of this article, there's a nice quote from Elizabeth Warren, featured here that said, essentially she slammed the ride-hailing companies for undermining the economic safety net of worker protections built over the last century. So essentially, what Elizabeth Warren was saying in this is because workers are classified as contractors versus employees, they don't have a lot of the same protections you normally think an employee would have, things like collective bargaining and things like that. So I want to make the point that we are not going to refute this at all. So I think she had some really valid points. At the same time, the reason why I put this up there is if you kind of Google Uber, Lyft, regulation or policymakers, this tends to be the flavor of what you see. So for better or worse, a lot of the attention that's been paid to these companies have been about the negative consequences associated with it. Now, at the same time, this is something that kind of brought about potential regulation. You have Assembly Bill 5, AB 5 in California, which was essentially going to reclassify workers as employees, which would have triggered federal and tax withholding, healthcare, pension requirements, compensation, unemployment insurance obligations, things like this, right? And this was something that Uber and Lyft cared so much about that they ultimately said, one, we're not going to comply with this, but two, we're going to pledge 90 million towards Prop 22, which is essentially, it was voted on last month, and it was a carve out that excluded Uber, Lyft, and DoorDash from AB 5. Now, all this to say, this is a topic that's gotten a ton of attention, the implications of the gig economy. And the reason why I put this up there is we simply want to introduce one more potential piece of information about what the gig economy, how it's shaped labor markets, that policymakers that can then weigh the pros and cons once they have all the information. So we're just going to contribute to this by just offering up one additional thing in which the gig economy has kind of changed labor markets. Okay, so if you go back to your basics, if you go back to micro one of the first things that we learned was that individuals prefer to smooth consumption, right? This was the foundation for life cycle models, right? And the reason why is you have, not surprisingly, you have a concave utility function, right? You don't want to have low utility when you have very low income. You want to smooth this over the life cycle. So if we're thinking about this from the perspective of a household, when are these welfare impacts or effects the biggest? Well, it's when you're really low, when you're really steep on that utility curve, right? Where you have really extreme negative income shocks. That's where this ability to smooth consumption really has its bite. And this is going to motivate the setting that we're looking at. We are going to look at one of the settings which is going to have kind of the biggest welfare effects for an individual household. And that's going to be studying the time around job loss when you have these really extreme negative events. Okay, now when you think about what happens whenever somebody loses their job, well, typically there's going to be two responses in addition to seeking reemployment. So one, they may claim UI benefits if they're eligible. And two, they may start to use some of the revolving lines of credit. So, put some expenses on the credit card bill, be able to put food on the table, and they're going to be able to pay off the credit card bill in the future, right? These are the two typical responses to job loss. But it's really important to think about these things. One, so UI, this was kind of motivated by the ability to smooth consumption through time, intertemporal risk sharing and cross-agent risk sharing. But at the same time, I would argue these things are half measures. They don't perfectly solve the problem because we know that for both of these things, they have negative implications, right? So for UI, a lot of attention has been paid to, well, if I increase the size of the safety net, if I increase UI benefits, it's going to dampen incentives to find reemployment. Well, I look for a job if I can almost get my complete set of wages from the government in the meantime. Now, something we kind of learned through the financial crisis is households levering up also have negative consequences. You have things like negative externalities through strategic default, stuff me and Sufi kind of looked at. Asaf Bernstein has a really cool paper looking at basically debt overhang from a household leads them to provide less labor in the future because that money is going to go to creditors. So both of these things, while they do allow a household to kind of smooth consumption, they're what I would think of as half measures because they don't solve the root problem, right? The root problem was a person used to have a job, they no longer do. What would they really like? Snap my fingers, have a new job, exchange my labor supply for income, and go about my business. And so this is going to kind of motivate the kind of the question that we're going to look at, which is, well, what happens when we do ease those frictions a little bit? Now, the setting or the shock we're thinking about is the introduction of the gig economy into an area. It's going to introduce the ability to have these, very temporary, very quick liquid jobs that allow me to exchange labor for income while I seek reemployment. So this is going to ultimately frame our question, which is, does the introduction of Uber, which is our proxy for the gig economy, the thing we can observe, affect a worker's propensity to use either one of these other things, either UI or credit consumption? So at that point, I will stop for any questions if anybody has any.
Okay, question number one. Do you also consider workers' savings for smoothing consumption in case of job loss?
So we are going to think about this as, we're not going to document that workers essentially are smoothing consumption through savings. So one, we're not going to be able to see savings. We're only going to be able to see credit outcomes. So things like credit card balances and things like that. At the same time, it's like, I can see this being something, if I do have liquid savings, it would allow me to smooth consumption. If you look at stats for the US, the median person, it's something like they wouldn't have enough liquid savings to meet a $400 expense, is the number that you always hear quoted. And so for a lot of people, I don't think this is viable. It's not something that we observe. If anything, this is just going to, in some sense, attenuate our results. But I'm not going to say attenuate because, this doesn't hurt our identifications. This doesn't hurt the implications we have. You want to view our thing as, does the introduction of Uber change responses when you already condition on having savings, that you'd have in a normal household? So it's not something that we're going to be able to observe and have nice cross-sectional cuts. If you did, you could think about it as people with less savings, the effects would probably be stronger than I'm going to document. But unfortunately, that's not kind of information that we have access to.
All right, so how much time does it take for a person to qualify as Uber driver? What's the process? How much does it cost?
Great question. So this is something where, and this is, I think, what separates the gig economy and things like Uber from traditional temp work, where it, maybe is a longer process to get qualified, to get set up. When I did grad school in Austin, I had a car. I didn't have any need for Uber, and I moved to Boston. And I remember I'd heard about Uber, so I thought, okay, I'm going to use this to get around. And so I start getting on the app to basically sign up for an account so I can use Uber to go from point A to point B. And I made 2 pages into it, and it started asking for things like driver's license number. And I thought that was really weird. And I realized I had gone to the wrong portal, and I was signing up to be a driver, and I'd basically gone halfway through this process. So that's a nice little anecdote, but the numbers that I've seen is people have qualified within a day, 2 days, maybe at most 3 days become an Uber driver in most places. They kind of build the service off the ability to quickly engage workers, quickly engage drivers to be put on the platform. So we think this is being a very fast alternative, which is probably why this has much more bite than traditional temp services, if you will.
So Uber puts some requirements of what kind of quality your car should be in order to qualify as an Uber driver. So do you think these effects are still going to be more pronounced for people with, let's say, pre-termination, middle class jobs rather than people who had been separated from lower income jobs and probably didn't have a, reasonable quality car to qualify as an Uber driver?
Okay, so that's a great question. And this is something that the reason why I love this one, it's going to actually motivate a test. We just got some super cool new data that we haven't been able to incorporate into the draft, but we kind of know some preliminary results off of this. So essentially, to qualify for the Uber X, the traditional main product line, when Uber was being rolled out, and up till I think recently, and even in some MSAs still, the requirement is the car has to be less than 15 years old. And it has to be a sedan, 4 doors, things like that. And so I would think that, I would argue a lot of cars qualify for this. When we construct our measure, we're going to be thinking about that 15-year requirement, and we're going to look at credit panels and people that purchase cars within the last 15 years as a proxy for this, which isn't perfect. But we just got some cool new data on car registration that we're going to be able to link into our panel in the future. And we basically have some cross-sectional cuts where we are comparing cars that are 16, 17, 18 years old from those that are 12, 13, 14. And we're going to see that, preliminary results suggest that they kind of reinforce all of our findings, that it is the eligible cars where there's bite versus cars that are slightly outside of that range. So it's something that's going to come in a very, in the very near future for a draft. It's just something that we weren't able to kind of get everything put together for this draft of the paper.
Would you be able to distinguish between voluntary and involuntary job loss? Are you concerned that Uber drivers that are more likely to leave jobs are ones doing well with Uber?
Absolutely. So this is going to be huge. This is going to be key when we're actually thinking about the sample we construct, because one of our key outcomes is going to be unemployment insurance. One of the things to qualify for UI is you have to lose the job not of your own action. So essentially, it has to be a company that's laying off workers for lack of capital. It can't be that either you quit or you show up late or you show up hungover or anything like that. So we're going to have, from these employers, we're going to have the reason for the layoff, the reason for the job loss. That's going to allow us to identify people that are more likely or are going to be eligible for UI versus those that wouldn't be. And we're only going to be looking at the people that were laid off because of lack of capital and things like that. Now, at the same time, when you think about like, well, maybe there's some anticipation of being laid off, in some of our tests, we actually kind of drop the months where there's more seasonality. So you see seasonality in terms of layoffs right around the holiday season in November, December, January, because this is you get hired for the holiday season as like a FedEx driver or an assistant, and then you're going to be laid off. We can drop those seasonal months from our sample, and the results get a little bit stronger, suggesting that this is, the bite is really there for people that don't anticipate being laid off. So it's one of the things that's it's a new test, a new table that we haven't dropped into the paper yet, but we kind of know the results, and we're going to put it into that next version as well.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so getting back to this question of does the introduction of Uber affect the propensity to rely on UI? Anecdotally, we kind of know the answer is yes. And the reason why I say that is because there's a nice New York Times article around the 2019 layoff, which essentially, they highlighted the story of this woman here, Angela Kelly. So she was a federal worker who had her job and was furloughed. And while she was being furloughed, while she didn't have her paychecks, she became an Uber driver to kind of support herself. And this is something that, during the 2019 layoff, 2019 shutdown, there was a lot of concern and there was a lot of mention in the media of, air traffic controllers moonlighting for Uber and they're going to be too tired and put us all at risk, right? These were ideas that we kind of knew were out there, that people were going to turn to the gig economy whenever they weren't getting their federal paychecks. And this wasn't something exclusive to the 2019 shutdown. Way back in 2013, before Uber was introduced, you had similar things. So TaskRabbit put out a tweet, and there's a person who replied to it, said, essentially the first tweet was, we noticed that there was an uptick in people applying to be TaskRabbit workers. And so somebody said, well, did you proactively market to government workers? I'd love to see kind of information on that. And this was TaskRabbit's response. No, it was totally organic. The week of the shutdown, we had 13,000 applications in a single day. Okay, so essentially saying that when the government was shut down, you saw a ton of people kind of moving to this platform to provide short-term supply of labor for income while they were waiting to be reemployed by the government. So these are kind of anecdotes that support this idea that, well, the gig economy has kind of changed the way people respond to job loss in some sense. And so we're going to take this and we're going to try to apply it systematically to a full, broad sample in the US and see how all this holds up. So what are we going to find? We're going to find, following the introduction of Uber into an area, laid off workers who are more able to work for Uber. I'll get to in a minute what I mean by more able. They're going to be 5% less likely on a relative term to claim UI benefits in a given month. They're going to have a relative decrease in their outstanding credit balances of about 1.3% of their total amount outstanding. But more importantly, rather than just looking at like the amount of debt, we actually see an increase in their credit worthiness. So they're going to be about 3% less likely to become credit delinquent following Uber's introduction into their area. So I haven't got to the identification strategy yet. in your head, you should think about this as kind of a staggered diff-in-diff. And so when you think about that, you think about challenges to identification. Well, maybe it is, once Uber comes into an area, the type of worker being laid off is changing. We're assuming that this population or this distribution is not changing pre and post Uber coming into an area. Or maybe, we know Uber entered into large areas first and then smaller areas, big CBSAs and smaller CBSAs. So maybe there are time and variant differences across these areas, and our sample is going to be overweighted on the big CBSA side for Uber, and the small CBSA side is going to be the control group, and maybe this is driving the differences. Or maybe there's going to be some strategic entry of Uber around, pre-existing trends for working conditions. Maybe labor markets are tightening or loosening right around when Uber enters, and this is going to be driving our results. These are all potential challenges. We don't find any evidence kind of supporting any of these challenges or other things you might think about. So in terms of, actually, before I get to related lit, any follow-up questions on this?
Are you able to test for changes around the bill in California, forcing these companies to treat employees as employees rather than contractors?
So, okay, that would be a really interesting thing to look at. It's not going to be part of our sample. At the same time, actually, I don't think I would expect an effect there, because when they, AB5 came out, Uber basically said, we're going to ignore it. So I wouldn't expect there really to be a big change around that. Now, there have been other instances where you've had Uber kind of get kicked out of areas. This happened in Austin, where there was a bill passed that said, we require you to have fingerprints for all of your drivers as a safety precaution. Uber said, we're not going to do this. It's too much cost for us. And they kind of pulled out of Austin. Now, the reason why we don't really exploit those kind of events is what you saw is right when Uber kind of pulled out of Austin, other companies stepped in, places like Fasten, and said, we'll do it. And they provided the same service. So anybody who was driving for Uber probably would have just switched to this other. So anytime you think about nice times when Uber gets kind of extracted from an area, the problem is a lot of times there is, a replacement that steps in right after that. And so it would, you wouldn't really expect to find a result there. Other questions?
All right, thank you.
That's it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so in terms of related literature, we're going to tie into two big areas in terms of the outcomes we're going to look at. So, there's a very mature literature on unemployment insurance, kind of all the heavy hitters are in there. There's a budding kind of set of research in terms of household leverage, right? This is stuff the financial crisis kind of turned our eyes to that with a lot more interest. So we're going to be able to speak a little to both of these sets of literature, and we're also going to contribute to an ever-growing kind of new literature on the gig economy and all the effects of this. So this is not intended to be an extensive sample of papers, right? This is actually an older slide, so I definitely need to update this. And this definitely understates the amount of research that's been done in this area. We hope our paper kind of contributes nicely to it. Okay, so to give you a kind of sense of what we're going to do, I'm going to talk about the data, go through our empirical strategy and potential challenges to identification, then jump straight into the results before concluding. So we're going to have two, kind of the intersection of two data sets for our study. So the first of these, very simple, we just need product rollout dates from Uber. So we are going to use all the product rollout dates between the start of the company in June 2012 and March 2016. So this is going to be 163 CBSAs in terms of coverage. We're going to focus on UberX. This gets back to that question of, who really can take advantage of this. So in some instances, Uber Black was a more premier service that got put out before UberX. But to drive for that, you need something like a Mercedes. It's got to be less than 5 years old. So it's like very few people who qualified for this. So we're going to just focus on UberX as kind of the entry dates that we really care about, because I think this is where the largest number of people are going to be able to drive for the service. Now, I mentioned we're going to use this staggered Diff-in-Diff approach. So anytime you do this, you really want some nice variation in when entry happened, right? If all the entry events happened on 2 days in your sample, it really doesn't give you a ton of variation to work with. And when I first started this, I was like a little worried that was going to be the case. Here is the variation in Uber's entry across areas. And it was surprisingly way more variation through time than I would have expected. So you had the initial pilot markets when the company started, so New York and San Francisco. And then, you had a little bit of a lag because you were unsure if the Uber is really going to take off. And as it started to, suddenly you had a ton of markets being entered in over about a 2.5 year stretch in terms of when kind of Uber entered into areas. So we have tons of time series variation that we're going to be able to exploit in this staggered Diff-in-Diff. Now, in terms of kind of spatially, what does this look like? Perhaps not too surprising. If you rank states by early versus late entry, dark is earlier. You do see that Uber entered the coasts earlier, kind of East Coast, West Coast before the middle of the US, but you still had relatively early adoption in places like Texas, Oklahoma, Colorado, places like that, right? So this is not something in Georgia. So these are things where if you think about just like a coastal effect, I would argue that's not really what's going to be at play in our sample. Now, to this data, we're going to marry a second data set that's maybe a little less, hasn't been seen as much. So essentially, what you probably have seen from Equifax is their credit panel. This is stuff that, like, this in household finance has become a lot more kind of widespread. But we have a nice addition to this. So essentially, we're going to be able to marry this credit panel to worker level UI claims, unemployment insurance claims, and job turnover. Okay, so the way this works is essentially companies, whenever you have a company and you have employees that qualify for unemployment insurance, you've got to do a lot of record keeping. So if I'm going to run this company and I have 100 employees and they're all going to qualify for unemployment insurance, I have to pay attention to basically, when do people get laid off? What were their wages? And then if the state contacts me to verify as somebody applies for unemployment insurance that they're not misstating their wages or their qualifications or things like that, I have to respond to the state. And so this put a big burden on companies. And so Equifax basically stepped in and said, why don't we solve this problem for you? We will be your custodian. You give us all your information and we will handle the interactions with the different states. Okay, and so for any contributing or any participating employer, they're going to provide all their administrative data to Equifax in terms of worker turnover data. So this is going to be the reason why you're separated from your job. And then Equifax is also going to have information from the state UI agencies in terms of when do people apply for unemployment insurance, how much of the benefits, and things like that. And so because this is administrative, Equifax is basically able to link this UI data to credit panels to construct this nice data set to kind of work with. Now, in terms of representative of this, this is kind of what time series variation looks like in the layoffs in our sample. And you're going to notice this massive spike right at the start of 2013. Now, the reason why there was this spike was I mentioned that companies had to comply with state agencies requesting information. Prior to 2013, if you didn't really respond in a timely manner, there wasn't a big penalty. It wasn't a really big deal. But in the start of 2013, essentially, a federal regulation was passed that basically said that increased the cost or the burden of what happens when you don't, respond in a timely manner in terms of penalties, fees, and things like that. So this really put an onus on companies to have to deal with this, in a timely fashion. And so that's why they started to outsource this to Equifax at that point in time. So I will say we can trim everything prior to 2013, and all of our results look virtually the same. Now, in terms of kind of geospatial variation in this, what does it look like across states? So this is a heat map of the layoffs in our sample scaled by state level job separations from the J2J database from the census. And so we've scaled this and normalized it to a median value of 1. Anything darker is slightly overrepresented, anything lighter is slightly underrepresented in our sample. You do see a couple of hot spots in terms of Nevada and Maryland, but for the most part, you have relatively even variation across the US. Now, I'll note that any state that's just purely white, they're not in our sample because Uber never entered those states within our time period. No city in that state got treated, and so we just kind of tossed them from the sample. Questions?
Yeah. Jordan, so could you explain what is, why you focus solely on Uber? There's also Lyft and other car sharing, services.
Yeah.
So, and many drivers, in fact, do operate in both platforms or several platforms. Would it strengthen your effect? How do you think it's going to contaminate your results?
Great question. So you can kind of think of two versions of this. So the first would be cities, CVSAs, where Uber entered first and then Lyft, Fast, and other companies entered a couple months, a year after. For those, I would tend to think that, well, a driver's probably, if they're going to drive for Uber, they would drive for Lyft. If they're going to drive for Lyft, they would drive for Uber. And so when we turn the Uber indicator on, it's going to capture that entire post period. And so that wouldn't really have an effect. That wouldn't bias our results. It wouldn't strengthen them, wouldn't weaken them. I think we'd kind of capture all that. Now, you can think of another instance where, what if Lyft entered 6 months before Uber into a certain CVSA? Essentially, what's going to happen in our approach is there's going to be 6 months where a CVSA is in fact treated, but we view it as a control group. We view it as Uber not being in that area yet. And so what that's going to do, that's going to attenuate our results and bias against finding a result. The reason why we focus on Uber, we had data for Uber. I've reached out to someone at Lyft. The hope is at some point we'll get their entry dates as well, and then we can take the minimum of Uber and Lyft to really do this. So I can't really speak to how many markets Lyft entered before Uber. My prior would be it's like the minority of the markets, but I don't know that for sure. So we're still trying to get that data, but for now, this is just kind of a data limitation that's going to bias against finding a result.
To follow up on this question, what about introduction of other gig jobs in the area, such as food delivery, Grubhub, DoorDash, and so on?
Yeah. Okay, great question. So this is one where my understanding for a lot of these is they did follow Uber into areas. Now, to the extent that they didn't, we're really going to be using variation in people and like within an area of people that we'd argue, qualify for Uber or easily able to drive for Uber. And so what I mean by that, and this is kind of like front running our identification, we're going to be focusing on people that we proxy as having a car versus non-car owners. Okay, so if you think about a gig economy job that doesn't really rely on a car, that's not really going to push our results either way. Treated and control groups are going to be equally kind of affected by that. And so it doesn't really change much for us. Now, to the extent that these gig economy jobs do rely on cars and that other, gig economy platform entered before Uber, again, that would just attenuate our results. But it's something that we can't really speak to. So there's a really nice paper. Emily Jackson has a job market paper kind of looking at the full set of gig labor jobs in an area, kind of constructs this measure and people's likelihood of working for these things. So she's kind of looked along those lines. But for us, there's nothing that it would give you an obvious bias in finding results. If anything, these things are just going to attenuate point estimates downwards a little bit.
Okay, this is the question probably going a little bit, towards the later part of your presentation, but do you think that Uber drivers will stay out of the normal workforce longer?
It's a great question. This is one, I don't want to go into too much detail. I mean, the answer I think is yes, absolutely. The reason why I don't want to go into too much detail is it's something that we are already kind of working on in a follow-up paper in terms of like how this is going to change a worker's response to reemployment. You can think about this as changing that trade-off between looking a little longer for a job, finding a better match, things like that. This is actually something Emily Jackson did look at in her paper, and she's essentially showing that in the short run, people earn more income. In the long run, they earn lower income. And her argument is that, these are people that they commit to the gig economy and they never re-enter the traditional workforce. And so there has been some work on this. We've got a preliminary table that's basically showing this does change the time to reemployment. But it's I don't lean on this test at all because it's one that's just based on our sample, which, we have to observe both employers in our data set. So there's kind of issues there. But I do imagine there's an effect. It's something we're going to kind of flesh out fully in a new project, but not something I'm going to speak too much here.
All right, thank you.
Sure. Okay, so to give you a sense of what is our sample going to look like. So we are going to start with going back to one of the earlier questions. We're going to start by identifying 20 million layoffs. So not job separations. These would be job separations where the job description makes it reasonable that you'd qualify for unemployment insurance. Things like lack of capital, mass layoff, things like that. So we're going to identify 20 million of these in our sample. Then we're going to have to randomly sample 1 million of these. And this is just from technical limitations. We run all this stuff on the servers at Equifax, and there was a rule that was put in place. Basically, you got to limit the number of observations. Otherwise, you crash the server. the company is like not very happy about that. So we randomly sampled 1 million observations from this. We then trimmed it down to within 1 year of the start of Uber coming into the sample and the last date, which we have Uber entering, which is going to give us 840,000 layoffs. And then the last thing, because we're doing a staggered diff-in-diff, kind of treated and control or Uber entered your area, we basically require that at some point within our sample, Uber is going to come into your CVSA. So this is going to make it more of an apples to apples comparison over treated and control groups. I will say you can run this without this last restriction. All of our results kind of go through. I think they even get stronger, but I think this is the more appropriate one because, you know, the analogy I like to use is I think it's more appropriate to compare places like Austin to Houston in Texas, not Austin to Valley View, which is my hometown. It has 700 people. Like the job markets, the labor markets are very different in those two places. And so this is more of an apples to apples comparison over places where Uber is going to enter at some point. Okay, so here are kind of summary stats. I'm not going to dwell on these a ton. Well, before I get to it, we have 500,000 layoffs in our sample. For each of these layoffs, we're going to construct a 25-month time series around the layoff. So we're going to take 12 months prior to it, 12 months following it. This is going to be our pre-layoff, post-layoff segment. So it's going to give us 25 monthly observations per layoff, which is going to give us a little over 12 million worker month observations, right? And so we got a couple key statistics. We've got things like your likelihood of receiving any benefits in a given month, which is 1.7%. This is including pre and post layoff. It also includes, unfortunately, people who we can't guarantee that you do qualify for unemployment insurance. Two of the requirements that you'd need in most states to qualify is meeting a minimum wage amount and also being employed for at least the last 2 quarters. Unfortunately, that's the data that we don't have. And so our sample is going to include some people who just don't qualify for unemployment insurance. We also have things like the benefit amount you're going to receive. This is not conditional on having UI benefits at all. So this includes a lot of zeros in terms of people who just aren't receiving, a paycheck from the government in that given month. We've got things like total debt, so 32,000, which is a little on the low side in terms of the US population. You see things like credit score, 620. So our sample is weighted a little more towards the lower part of the distribution in terms of credit worthiness. The US has an average credit score of around 690. So we're a little below that, but this is still, a very big portion of the population. So we think this still kind of speaks to kind of an important question for a big sample of the US population that we should be thinking a lot about in terms of reliance on UI, reliance on credit. And then we have things like delinquency rates, which is going to be one of our key variables we're going to look at. And you're going to see that's not, delinquency is not a trivial thing in our sample, or a non-trivial amount of time. Across all your lines of credit, there's a 1 in 6 chance you're delinquent in a given month. 6% of months are going to be delinquent on some line of your credit. 1% are home delinquencies. Okay, so I'm going to get to empirical strategy, and then I'll go through kind of the baseline, and then kind of open it up for a couple more questions. So like I mentioned, our strategy is going to be based on staggered diff-in-diff. So we're going to be using the introduction of Uber across cities, across CVSAs through time. So for now, let's just keep it really basic. Let's think about how do we estimate the effect of Uber on all laid off workers. So this is just a standard diff-in-diff, right? Your left-hand side, outcome of interest, maybe it's delinquency rates. Beta would pick up, well, how much do delinquency rates go up once you get laid off from your job? But what we care about is, does that post-layoff differential change once Uber enters into your area? So Lambda would kind of pick up that interaction term. This is the effect of Uber across all areas. Now, because this is a panel for individuals, we can stick in a person fixed effect, which is going to take out your just average delinquency rate across time. Okay, we can toss in things like if this was individual I, CVSA J time T, we can put in a CVSA by time fixed effect to kind of pull out local economic conditions. That would, of course, subsume the uninteracted Uber term. And so you'd still be able to kind of identify this all off of this interaction between layoff and Uber. Okay, so if I'm thinking about this baseline that we're going to build off of, what's the identifying assumption? The identifying assumption here is that Uber's entry into an area it's not going to be correlated with someone unobservable that affects basically an individual's decision following layoff. So it's going to shift beta following layoff. Basically, if Uber had it entered into the area, that beta wouldn't shift, wouldn't change. Okay, so that is the identifying assumption we're going to be kind of building things off of. Now, this is something where if you think about Uber's entry, it's really important to think about what drove Uber's entry. So something Greg Bichuk kind of highlighted in his job market paper is that Uber's entry was is predominantly determined by the population of an area and smartphone penetration or adoption, right? And something we verified, we see the same things. And so you need, when you think about this identifying assumption, you need that to probably be related to population for this to really have any bite for us. Any questions before I go on?
Yeah, hi, this is Sabrina. I'm just wondering if what you care about is the timing of Uber entering or the timing of demand for Uber, because for a driver, they can't, and I presume the other papers have probably addressed this already, but maybe even explain how it's not endogenous when the local population starts using Uber in a meaningful way, and therefore really creating employment opportunities, because it doesn't matter if Uber enters a place and nobody uses it.
So, okay, so that's a great question, Sabrina. I think this is something where that had a lot of bite when you talked about pilot markets like San Francisco and New York, right? You saw that there was, if you actually plot Uber rides, it was kind of a steady growth for the first 6 months, a year, and then it really kind of took off. I think what we have to realize is once that really took off and Uber started entering other markets, Uber was already just this overnight success. Everybody kind of knew about it. And so the binding constraint, I think, in a lot of these CVSAs isn't that, well, we need to build up, demand for people to use this service. It's when is Uber going to enter our area? I want to be able to go downtown. I don't want to pay for cabs. I know Uber's out there. We're just kind of waiting for them to come into our area. And so it's almost like you had pre-built up demand, just waiting for Uber to kind of enter, right? And so that's something like once you get past the initial pilot markets, I think this was really at play in terms of it wasn't a demand constraint. It was more of a supply constraint of, Uber determining when to kind of go into a spot. You had I actually talked to a lot of people and they're just like, basically, I'm frustrated that we still don't have Uber. Like I've been wanting this forever and they still haven't chose to come into our spot kind of thing. So it's like, if we're thinking about everything being like New York, where it takes a year for this to kind of pick up, I would agree with you. I'm going to show you some time series stuff around when the effects start to, relative to Uber's entry start to pick up. And you're going to see that these things are near immediate, which would suggest that for most markets, this isn't really at play. But great question. Others?
Does Uber entry affect female and male differently given Uber's reputation?
Oh, okay. So this is interesting. This is a great question. It's something that I have heard. Females are a little less likely to want to drive for Uber, even think about safety concerns and things like that. Unfortunately, this is not anything that we have data on. So we don't have kind of gender as a flag in our data set to be able to identify males versus females. It would be great to kind of look at that. I think the prediction would be the effect might be stronger for males, given all the anecdotes have said, males a little more likely to drive for Uber, a little less, concern over well-being and things like that. But it's not something that we have information on.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so this was just the baseline, right? If you wanted to estimate the effect on Uber across all laid off workers, but that's really not what we're getting at. What we want to think about is who are those workers that are most able to drive for Uber? Now, when you think about that, who is the person, if I get laid off, is most likely to be able to do this? It's somebody that owns a car, right? Before they get laid off. So this is something that for now, we're going to infer car ownership from our credit panel. I teased that we just got a new data set that we're kind of working with, some preliminary stuff over car registrations. All the stuff today is going to be based on this credit panel. So we're going to identify somebody as an owner if they have, which is a little bit of an abuse of the term, because if you have a lease, you're not technically owning the car. But we're going to classify owners as anybody with an auto loan or lease between 2000 and the month prior to job loss. Okay, so this is basically going to give us that ability to identify people that likely meet this 15-year requirement. They have a vehicle, they're able to drive for Uber. So here is kind of the spatial variation and what our ownership proxy looks like. You see it's kind of relatively uniform, a little lighter in New York, a little heavier in kind of the central US. This is kind of consistent with statistics over car ownership rates across areas. And with this, we're going to be able to elaborate and kind of build on our difference in difference to make it into a triple Diff-in-Diff, right? So we're basically going to take our last structure of our specification and we're going to add in this car ownership indicator. So when we do this, we have our outcome of interest. Now we care about this triple interaction term. Beta is still going to capture, how much do delinquencies go up once you get laid off. Layoff times Uber is going to pick up, well, does that differential change following Uber's entry into your area? But what we really care about is, does that differential change for car owners relative to non-owners following Uber's entry into their area? So this is going to be the term that we're going to focus on kind of in the presentation and throughout. So now, because we have this difference between car owners and non-owners, our identification assumption becomes a little tighter, right? Because now, for this to be challenged, you need that Uber's entry was correlated with an unobservable, but that unobservable differentially affects car owners relative to non-owners following job loss, okay? So this is something that, this is going to be the foundation of what we are looking at.
Okay,
now,
so Jordan, here's a question. So is prior car ownership really a barrier to becoming an Uber driver? People can buy a car fairly quickly if they don't have a car.
That's a good question. So this is one where, and there have been other versions of this, right? So you could say, I know Uber and Lyft had these rental programs. Maybe you wanted to rent a car if you didn't own one already. For the rental programs, those didn't come in until the last 4 months of our sample. So we don't think that's going to really challenge anything. We are measuring car ownership in the month prior to job loss. When we actually look at, are people more likely to buy a car like around their job loss, either right in anticipation of being laid off next month or even following layoff, we don't see any change in your likelihood of buying a vehicle kind of like leading up to this. It's something where if this was at play, I would expect there to be a big spike in kind of car purchases for people who didn't own cars once they got laid off. The reason why I don't think this is really there is because suddenly I don't have a job. I have no way of kind of demonstrating a steady income stream. It's probably pretty costly to buy a vehicle at this point, given all the uncertainty of, do I want to drive for Uber or I just want to like look for a new job? And so I think this is one of those things where it could be at play. It would attenuate our results. I just don't think, given those frictions, that it'd be very easy to kind of get access to this car in that sense. Now, the last one, and this is something we can't rule out, is perhaps I know somebody with a car. We form an arrangement. They let me use their vehicle during the day. I give them some of my money. That is something that we, of course, we can't observe that, and it would just attenuate and bias against finding results, if you will.
Okay.
Other questions?
Very good for now.
Okay. So in terms of this identifying assumption, we have looked at, well, is there something about people being laid off around Uber coming into their area? It's in the paper. We don't find any evidence that layoff rates are changing around Uber's entry into your area, but you can kind of reform this identifying assumption. Essentially, what we're kind of assuming is that the distribution of workers that are being laid off isn't changing following Uber's entry. So what we can do to actually test this is we can adapt our approach where the outcome is going to be some worker characteristic measured prior to layoff. And we're going to say, well, following Uber's entry into your area, of course, there could be a difference between somebody owning a car and not owning a car, but does that difference change following Uber's entry into your area? So here are some kind of preliminary specifications run like this for credit scores, debt balances, number of credit or accounts outstanding, percent of your accounts that are delinquent, statistically insignificant results across this. So it doesn't look like the distribution of workers being laid off is changing for car owners relative to non-owners as kind of an initial support of our identifying assumption. And I'm going to have some other stuff in a minute that's really going to kind of support this identifying assumption even more. Before I get to the results, any kind of follow-up questions?
No, we're going good. Thank you.
Okay. So we're going to consider 3 outcomes. 2 I'm going to focus more on. Take-up rates of UI, which I'm going to focus more on. I'm going to show you some stuff on credit balances. I don't think it's as interesting, so I'm not going to spend as much time on it. The thing I think is more interesting on the credit side is how do you perform on your credit? This really speaks to things like negative externalities when houses lever up in kind of economic recessions and things like that. So I'm going to focus more on that stuff. Now, again, just to remind you, what do we care about? We care about this triple interaction term, which is going to be the relative change following layoff in one of these outcomes, maybe credit performance. Once Uber enters your area, but specifically that difference following Uber's entry for somebody who owns a car versus non-owners. This is the thing that we really care about. So I'm going to begin with a little graphical demonstration of what the effects look like. So I'm going to split the sample into a 2x2 set of groups, segmented on is Uber in your area or not? Do you own a car or not? So a little 2x2 set. And we're going to compute UI participation rates in event time around me losing my job, right? For the 12 months prior to me losing my job, the 12 months after, T0 is the month I lose my job, ironically enough. So for ease of illustration, I'm going to plot the difference, not between just the four groups. I'm going to break it into the difference between car owners and non-owners, both before Uber is present, which is going to be the blue line, and then after Uber is present, which is going to be the black line. Okay, and so I'm going to show this figure. You're going to see two things that stand out. So the first of these, these things are zero, around zero, leading up to the loss. The reason why they're non-zero is because there's a small set of people in our sample that they have been laid off kind of twice within the last year. And so technically they could be drawing UI, they stop getting UI, they get a new job, they get laid off from the new job, things like that. And so that's why there's kind of non-zeros here, but you're going to see this increase. So I'm going to focus on the blue line first. Remember, this is the difference between people who we proxy as being car owners and those that aren't car owners. So the positive values here simply indicate that somebody owning a car is more likely to apply for UI than somebody not owning a car. So this is something where, I don't need a story for why that's the case. I think this is kind of a natural thing. If you think about these people as maybe it's proxying for financial literacy and you know about UI, you're more likely to know about unemployment insurance. Maybe there's just a greater need to really meet these short-term debt payments. And so you're going to apply for UI more likely. Maybe you're going to look for a longer amount of time to find your next job. Like you're a little more picky. Could be any of these things. That's not a challenge to identification, right, for us. What we care about is, does this differential between car owners and non-owners, does it change following Uber's entry? And we see that's the case. We see in the black line that the point estimate is getting smaller, which is suggesting that there's suddenly a relative decrease in the propensity of car owners to apply for UI relative to non-owners, right? And so you do see that it is uniformly lower throughout this. Now, something that's kind of interesting and of note is you never see these lines cross, right? So one thing you may be concerned is, well, maybe in the first couple months, you're less likely to apply for UI, you try out Uber, you don't like it. And so then you just delay the time at which you then apply for UI and you just kind of backload this. The fact that these are uniformly lower suggests that that's not the case. That's not what's going on here. Okay, so that was just a graphical kind of representation of this. Can't really build a paper only on figures. And so here is that OLS regression of that triple Diff-in-Diff that I put out there. So in this first column, this is an indicator for you receiving non-zero benefits in a given month. So we've got the individual fixed effect, city by month fixed effects to take out local economic conditions. And what do we see? So this is scaled to be based on 100. And so this is a 28 basis point decrease in a person's likelihood of receiving UI benefits in a given month after layoff if they own a car following Uber's entry. You say 28 basis points, I don't really know how to interpret that. Well, the relative likelihood of the likelihood of a car owner getting a UI benefit in a post layoff month is 5.8 percentage points. And so this is roughly a 5% relative decrease in that baseline, which I think is a non-trivial amount when we're only identifying the effect of Uber and kind of gig economy type jobs. This is not something this is the entire gig economy. It's the Uber segment of things. So you can say, all right, this is unemployment insurance just receiving benefits. Maybe there's something to do with like changes in the amount of benefits you receive. You can look at the amount of benefits. You know, a 0 would be you don't get any benefits. Maybe you get $100 this week or $200, $300. You see consistent results on that. It is a relatively small point estimate, and that simply reflects the fact that there's a lot of zeros in our sample. People that just aren't receiving benefits at all, either because they already received a new job or they weren't really eligible in the first place. Okay, questions over take-up rates on UI before I kind of go on?
Okay, quick data question. In times of massive layoffs in a particular area, the number of unemployment claims increases, and some individuals in the affected area may end up counted more than once due to system backlog. Do you see that? Is it an issue in your data?
Mass layoffs, or you kind of lost me there.
When you have massive layoffs, sometimes the system basically shows the same people being laid off several times. Do you see that being an issue with your data?
Okay, so that is one where I know the number of people that show up in our data multiple times. It's very small. So it's less than 1%. I think it's probably less than 0.1%. We can certainly toss those people and rerun this. So something I can check on for later. One thing that we have done, right? We are thinking about this as this is maybe supplementing unemployment insurance, right? One nice thing about UI, we call it a safety net because you expect it to always be there in good times and in bad times. And so, one thing that would affect the economic channel and the way we interpret our results is, what if the effects of Uber in terms of UI take-up rates, they're only there in good times, they aren't there in bad times? That'd be a much different kind of implication of this. So we have run our results when we basically partition the sample into, we look at changes in 6-month unemployment rates or monthly unemployment rates over the last 6 months. And we just take the top 10% of unemployment increases. So think of these as local economic recessions. We actually find our results get stronger there, right? The idea that if I am more concerned about finding a new job, maybe I'm more likely to go to this as a short-term solution versus UI, because I know UI is going to expire after 6 months and I don't know if I'll have a new job or not. So this is something we didn't know which way the effects would go, but our results tend to get stronger when we condition on local economic downturns, if you will.
Why
so that goes beyond the question, but I thought it was interesting.
Why would someone not apply for unemployment benefits if eligible, even if that person can drive for Uber?
Great question. So there's kind of two things that you need to think about when you're thinking about this trade-off. So one, there is going to be some cost, some hassle of applying for UI, whether that's going online and filling out all the documentation or going to stand in the line in person if this is pre-COVID. So there is some cost. You think about, well, what's the benefit? In most states, the way this works is maybe I'm eligible to receive $200 in benefits in terms of UI. Now, at the same time, if I earn income while I'm receiving UI benefits, there's going to be an offset. Now, there in a lot of states, there's like a small amount that you can earn as just like odd job income without it affecting your benefits, $25 a week, things like that. But once you go above that $25, there's a 1-to-1 offset. And so if I'm going to work for Uber and get $400 this week and my benefits would have been $200, I don't get any benefits. And so I basically applied for UI. I have used 1 month of my eligibility for it up, and I'm not going to really receive benefits. So if I'm thinking about driving for Uber, maybe if it doesn't work, then I'll apply for UI benefits. I wouldn't want to double dip in this sense because I'm not going to get really anything from the UI side of things, and I'm going to burn 1 of my months of eligibility. So you could do this. It's not really going to benefit you much, and you're still going to have to go through that process of applying for UI, documenting, showing the fact that you're looking for a new job, things like that. It varies state by state, but you've seen anecdotes that this is not a trivial cost to really applying for UI that kind of scares a lot of people away. Other questions?
When you look at how many people get laid off versus how many people drive for Uber with 4.8% magnitude, what share of Uber drivers would have to be recently laid off?
To make up that full effect. Yeah. That is something, it's a little tougher to think about that, because if there are people who are driving for Uber and they're still applying for UI, they would kind of contribute to both groups, right? Which would affect this. The numbers, the only number I've really seen over, your likelihood of driving for Uber when you get laid off, right? In some sense, you're asking about the first stage. There was a survey, it was about 1,200 drivers. It's not really going to answer the question, but it basically said, what's the reason you're driving for Uber? And about a third of them said, the reason why I'm driving is because I got laid off from my job. And so that kind of gives you a sense of what percent of drivers maybe are because of layoffs. It doesn't give you likelihood of driving for Uber if you do get laid off, right? But in some sense, I'm less interested about that first stage and way more interested about the second stage of what's the overall impact on UI usage. What's the overall impact on the benefits consumed on UI versus perhaps that money not being paid out by the state, instead people participating in the labor market.
Okay, how long do these drivers stay with Uber? Forever or just for a few months? Do you see much of a difference in terms of length of, employment with Uber for those who chose it voluntarily versus those who have been recently laid off?
Okay, good question. It's something where we can observe that. We have some tests where we're gonna select a set of drivers where you wouldn't expect them to view this as a long-term replacement. Basically, we're going to look at people that are living above median income areas, $90,000 plus areas, and that there's still effects for them. And I would argue for those types of workers, they're less likely to think of this as a long-term solution. We've conditioned our sample in one of our tests on people that we do observe them re-entering the workforce within 12 months, and our effects still they look roughly the same in that subset. I'm not saying this never happens. Emily Jackson, her paper does show that there's some people that, once you start working for Uber, you do continue in the long run to do this. But we've got some tests to suggest that this isn't like driving our result in any way, and the people are kind of re-entering the workforce.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so in terms of identification, one concern that you might think about is, well, we know Uber entered big areas first and then small areas. And so maybe there's just some inherent difference between car owners and non-owners in large cities versus small cities. And that's driving the result because we have a lot more large cities in the treated group than in the control. So the easy fix for this, we can toss in a CVSA by layoff by ownership fixed effect, which is going to completely pull out that story, right? So here was our initial set of tables that I just showed you. Here are those same tables once I include this fixed effect. Point estimate is basically unchanged. Standard errors get a little bit tighter for the likelihood of receiving benefits. The amount of benefits that you're going to receive conditional on receiving, or sorry, not conditional on receiving it, goes up. Log benefits goes up as well. So it's like, this is not the thing that's driving your result. You can put this in there, and if anything, our results get stronger. Okay, now you have the second concern. This is the one that's probably more likely. Is Uber strategically entering an area right around the time when labor markets are changing? Maybe it's something that's going to benefit car owners following job loss. Even if Uber hadn't entered the area, the effects would kind of still be there. There's like this, basically there's a pre-existing trend, right? That would be the concern. So what we can do, we can examine the effect of layoff by ownership around Uber's entry into an area. So basically we're going to replace that triple interaction term, replace the Uber indicator with this set of event time dummies of Uber entering a market. And so what we're going to see is that, how does this effect of layoff by ownership, is it there prior to Uber entering, or is it not there and then it materializes after Uber enters a market? So basically we're going to replace this triple interaction term with that double interaction with these event time dummies. Now, this is also going to help answer Sabrina's question from earlier about, well, if Uber enters an area and there's nobody really there to use the service, it doesn't benefit drivers. And so this will really help us see how fast does that effect materialize. Now, importantly, anything before 12 months and anything following 12 months after Uber enters, we're going to stick into those like bookend fixed effects. So those are going to capture kind of the long run effects of Uber in an area for the 12 months plus after Uber enters. And so this is that plot for likelihood of receiving benefits. And you're going to see flat leading up to Uber entering, Uber enters an area, and an immediate realization of the effect on UI, right? You see it kind of dance around a little bit. There's 1 or 2 months where it does come up. Importantly, this is like one specific month around Uber's entering, like standard errors are pretty big. But then this effect is basically picking up 12 months plus all the way into the future to show that this isn't just a transient effect that goes away after time. There's a long run effect of Uber on this that doesn't exist prior to Uber entering an area, or prior to the 12 months leading up to Uber entering an area. Okay, so that was the UI take-up rate stuff. I'm going to go a little quicker through the other outcomes. They're consistent with what I just showed you because I want to get to some of the cross-sectional tests. So here is when we look at all types of credit in terms of just your consumption. What is the outstanding balance? You're going to see that car owners following Uber Enter, they have a relative decrease in the amount of debt outstanding, $500, which is about 2% of the mean in our sample. Okay. Interestingly, this is something that's really being driven more like by home loans, not so much by credit cards. It's something where I've got kind of an explanation for this. We can talk about it later if you're interested. It really kind of ties into some of the work Dimitri Kostas has done in this area and kind of can support some of his findings. So while this is credit card balances outstanding, total debt outstanding, the more interesting one that I said was, is this going to affect credit performance, right? Really going to speak to things like local economic recessions and recoveries, household leverage, debt overhang and labor supply, things like that. So here is the likelihood of being delinquent on any of your, credit things, your credits outstanding. So if it's a home loan, credit card, things like that. And so again, these are scaled by 100. And what we're going to see is for car owners, following Uber coming into the area, your post-layoff change, you're going to be 50 basis points less likely to be delinquent, right? Now, relative to the unconditional delinquency rate of about 17%, this is a 3% relative change in your delinquency likelihood following Uber entry, which I would argue is not a trivial size, given this is the conditional effect of Uber on all people who own cars, not specifically those who are driving for Uber. You can segment this into, credit cards. You see strong effects there. You can look at home loans, smaller point estimate, similar relative effect because likelihood of being delinquent on your home is much lower than on your credit card. But all this kind of supports the idea that credit delinquencies and credit quality is going up for people who own cars following Uber entering. Okay, so with this, and this is the pre-existing trend or lack thereof, for delinquency rates, you don't really see an effect. Uber comes in, you start to see an effect that really kind of picks up a little more and stays statistically significant, going on throughout the sample. Okay, so now I'll pause for questions one more time, and then I'm going to get into some of these potential identification concerns.
We are good with questions at the moment.
No questions? Okay. Well, I had a delay, so I get some water. So, all right. So one concern you might still have is that there are differences between car owners and non-owners. You can see this in kind of summary stats, and so maybe there's still some omitted variable that's going to differentially affect these owners. So we have one test that's really going to leverage or take advantage of two groups, both who have access to a car, but have unequal access to the ability to drive for Uber. So what this test is really going to exploit is the difference between people with auto loans and auto leases, right? And the idea is both have access to a vehicle, but an auto lease typically has contractual obligations and mileage caps that 9,000 miles a year. That's really going to make it tough for me to drive for Uber for the next 2 months because it's really going to push me to the limit of my mileage caps and I won't be able to use my vehicle in the long run, right? So this is not a group where it really lends itself well to driving for Uber. And so what we're going to do is we're going to segment our sample into houses that are auto lease houses, individuals with auto leases versus individuals with auto loans. And we're going to see what the effects look like. And so we see that the households without an auto lease, the effects get stronger in terms of UI benefits, the amount you receive. In the paper, we have all the other outcomes in terms of delinquencies, credit amounts, things like that. Those with auto leases only, you don't see statistically significant effects. So the effects are concentrating these car owners, kind of supporting the idea that these are people not only that have access to a vehicle, but they also have the ability to use this in a normal fashion to drive for Uber versus those that, they have a vehicle, but it's really costly to do this because my mileage caps, it's going to just like increase the cost of this lease 5-fold kind of thing. Okay, now getting to the economic mechanism, I'm going to give you kind of two tests they're going to try to parse out two potential effects. So the first is the one that we kind of had in mind, that the gig economy in Uber is going to give us this supply of liquid jobs, short-term jobs that I can work for while I seek reemployment. The anecdotes that showed up front about the federal workers, this is that story. The federal workers, these are long-term jobs. They're probably not leaving the workforce or leaving federal work in the long term. They're simply driving for Uber to make ends meet while they wait for the shutdown to kind of, pick back or to kind of go away. And so this is that story we had in mind, that this is what the gig economy is going to do. It's going to provide these liquid jobs. Now, at the same time, you can view Uber as, well, maybe this is just a permanent employment shock. Maybe this is something that people are viewing Uber as a long-term reemployment prospect rather than going back into the traditional workforce. So I'm going to have a couple tests to try to pull these two apart. So in terms of maybe Uber is just providing a amount of jobs in the short run and those jobs go away, we can actually throw away the first year after Uber enters or the first 2 years after Uber enters a given market, and it's not going to drive our results. That's in the paper. I'm not going to show that. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on two other groups. So I'm going to focus on high-income employees, where it's less likely that you would kind of view Uber as a long-term alternative. And then I'm also going to focus on some heterogeneity in UI benefits, generosity. I'm going to talk more about that when I get to that test. Okay, so here is when we take the sample, we look at the zip code people are from, you take IRS statistics, SOI data on household income, we're going to split it on above median income and only look at that above median group where the average income reported is $90,000 a year. So within that sample, you do see a decrease in the point estimates, still statistically significant. You're still going to see people trading off UI take-up rates versus driving for Uber and the effect of Uber for car owners in this above median income group. I'm going to pause for questions before I get to that last test, and then I'm going to conclude.
Okay, are car owners and leasers comparable in characteristics? That probably relates to a little bit earlier stuff. Do they select into leasing a car?
Okay, that's a great question, and it's one I don't have the answer to it right now. So it's something we can certainly look at in terms of what are the characteristics of these people. For identification to kind of fail, what you would need, not only is there to be a difference between these two, but somehow that difference between people who own cars and lease cars is changing following Uber coming into their area, right? We know general characteristics of car owners versus not owners. There's no change in the people being laid off, following Uber coming into your area. And so you would need somehow for there to be a difference between lease and loan for that really to kind of, cause concern for us in some sense. So something we can certainly look at. Like I said, we've got this new sample that's going to be car registration data that's really going to allow us to compare two sets of people who have, they own their car 14 years versus 16 years, which I think can help with some of these concerns as well. And I think the initial stuff we've done looks, like it's consistent with what I'm kind of showing right now. Other questions?
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question, then we're going to defer the remaining one until the end of the presentation.
Okay.
So how do average earnings at Uber compare to unemployment benefits? I assume it varies by region, so that could potentially be another source of variation.
Yeah, okay, great question. So the numbers that I've seen in terms of hourly wages, the survey that I saw, it benchmarked at between $19 and $22 an hour, I believe. Now, this is something where some people, there's been disagreement over what do you actually earn, because that one does not take into consideration deterioration or your car basically losing some value. So when we talk about depreciation of cars, right? So this is something that some people have taken that off to say you earn less. I don't think that's really the apt comparison. And the reason why I say that is because if I have a car worth $5,000 right now, and I could snap my fingers and make it worth $4,000 and you give me $1,000 in cash, I would take that in a second if I am laid off and I am really strapped for cash, like the ability to transform my car's value into income. And so I think the $19 to $22 an hour is reasonable. That if you think about somebody working 30 hours a week, $600. This is more than the maximum benefits in almost every state in terms of what you can earn from UI. Some states it's as low as $235 per week, which is what I'm going to kind of show you in a second. Now, that does kind of lead into this final test. There is heterogeneity across states in how much you can receive in benefits. And if I'm thinking about Uber as a short-term prospect, I'm going to weigh this against this outside option of how generous is UI benefits, right? And so there are some states like Mississippi where it's $235 a week I could earn in UI benefits. Other states like Massachusetts, it's $680, right? And so if I'm viewing this as a short-term alternative, it's a much more attractive alternative to drive for Uber in Mississippi than it would in Massachusetts. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to split the sample into above and below median caps in terms of UI benefit generosity. And what we're going to see is that the effects are much stronger when you're talking about states and below median generosity states in terms of the effect of Uber relative to UI take-up rates. And above median states, still statistically significant, but much lower point estimates, kind of getting to that point. Okay, and then we have credit balances, and you see kind of similar effects, the credit delinquencies that's in the paper. Okay, just to wrap, because I know we're right at time, what are we doing in this paper? So we're going to examine the impact of Uber on a worker's response to layoff. And what we're going to find, that following Uber coming into your area, if you are able to work for the company or more likely to work for the company, you're going to be 5% less likely to claim UI benefits. You're going to decrease the amount of credit outstanding, but more importantly, you're going to become more credit worthy, have lower delinquency rates, right? And some signs that the effect is stronger. I should have kept this where it's not preliminary anymore. This is a locked table. The effects are stronger when UI benefits are less generous. So ultimately, what do we kind of view our paper as doing? Well, we do think this provides some evidence suggestive of like one of the big impacts the gig economy's had on reshaping labor markets. What I mean by that is it really has had an impact on how workers respond to job loss and kind of their response relative to other traditional means by which they would smooth consumption. So thank you so much. Any other questions, I'll stick around. I don't know that format, but I hope you enjoyed it. And I hope to see everybody soon at a conference somewhere.